Well, hello again, friends, and thank you for joining us on this another beautiful day in Rosh Hashanah. It's Tuesday, April the 21st, and we're devotionally today. We're going to be going back into the book of Proverbs and chapter 6, and the passage we're coming to now is kind of a curious one because in it Solomon is talking to his son about what he refers to as 7 things that the Lord hates, or 7 things that the Lord despises. Which, when you take into account that not only was Solomon one of the wisest people who ever lived, but also, which is how the Bible describes him, but also that he was writing here under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, this really ought to give us some insight into the personhood of God. Like, it's kind of like he's saying, if you want to know the things that God cringes at, if you want to know the things that really God can't stand, I'm about to share some of them with you. And like anybody, if you know things that they don't like, then you know a lot about them, don't you? Like, for example, in my own life, and this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and so it's trivial. I'm working on it. You can pray for me. But one of the things that I personally don't like is when you're in a store somewhere, which we're not very much these days, but if you're in a store somewhere and a cashier is counting you back change, one of the things I don't like is when they give you the bills before they hand you the coins. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal to people, but when I was growing up as a student in school, I was a cashier, and I was always taught that you counted back money. So you gave them coins first to get up to the even dollar, and then you counted back the bills to get them back to where they started. That's just how it was supposed to be done. But more often than not these days, I find that it's the other way around. And somebody will hand you one of those plastic-coated Canadian bills of ours. They'll lay it out on your hand and then dump a bunch of coins on top of it, and then it becomes a game to see how long you can hold on to it before you get it in your pocket. Usually it ends up on the floor for me. And again, that's a bit of a pet peeve, but now you know it, and now you know something about me. And so one of the things that I would just say is that for God, the things that are listed here for God, the things that he doesn't like here, are far less trivial than that. These are things that are actually significant enough for Solomon to say to his son that God doesn't like these things, God hates these things, and as a result of that, maybe these are some things that we should eliminate from our lives. These are, if we want to not just know God, but we want to please God, then we'll want to eliminate the things that he hates from our lives. And so I'm reading now in Proverbs chapter 6, and beginning with verse 16, Solomon says, there are 6 things that the Lord hates. No, 7 things he detests. And so he says 6, and then he's going to add a 7th one. We'll get to them all eventually. But he says this, and we're just going to touch on the first one this morning. He says, there are 6 things the Lord hates, no, 7 things he detests. And the first one is haughty eyes. Haughty eyes, which I know haughty isn't a word that we use very much these days. It's not a word that's part of our regular vocabulary. And so some translations actually replace it with the word proud. They talk about having proud eyes. But haughty is actually the better translation here. Because we use the word proud in different ways in our culture, in different contexts, and sometimes we might say that we're proud of our children for doing something or for behaving a certain way. God doesn't really have a problem with that. Sometimes we might be proud of an accomplishment that we were able to make, and in the right context, with the right attitude, God doesn't have a problem with that. But the kind of pride that haughtiness represents, and that God does have a problem with, the kind of pride that he hates or he despises, according to Solomon here, is the kind of pride that is accompanied by arrogance and the general sense that one person feels superior to some other person in some way. That's what this passage means by someone who has haughty eyes. And I mean, we've seen it, haven't we? Like, we see it in our world, in our own culture. We might say that someone would look down their noses on someone else. It's kind of the same thing. Maybe because they aren't as educated, maybe because they come from a different culture, or they live in a certain area, or they're disadvantaged financially or in some other way. Like, we live in a world where people often measure their own value or their own worth by comparing themselves to other people. And so it's not uncommon then to see that kind of haughty look, or those haughty eyes that God is speaking about, or that Solomon is speaking about on God's behalf, which is a reflection really of the state of a person's heart. And God says, I hate it. He's God who created each person just the way that they are, God who stamped his own image into every human being, God who cares for the hurting, who cares for the lowly, who cares for the disadvantaged, and who opposes prejudicial behavior, and who cared enough to send Jesus to die as much for the beggar on the streets as he did for the king in his palace. God says, I hate that kind of attitude. I hate that kind of arrogance. I hate haughty eyes. It's one of the things that we can actually know about him from the book of Proverbs here in the Bible. And again, in knowing it, the call on our own lives is to examine then our hearts and examine our attitudes, examine our own eyes, if you will, and looking instead through the eyes of God himself to see all people as equal in terms of personal value or worth. Would you join me? Let's pray together. Dear God, give us eyes that see what you see. Give us hearts to love who you love. Eliminate all arrogance and ignorance so that can so easily grow up in us in a world of privilege that we enjoy. And remind us regularly of the fact that all people are equally precious in your sight. Have a great Tuesday, everybody, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. God bless.